Welcome to the Teaching Change Podcast, where we explore issues of social entrepreneurship education and innovation. I'm your host, Jared Caliquet. On today's episode, we have a very special topic around productivity. What does it mean? How do you do it? And why are so many people bad at it? We have a very special guest today, Deanna Caliquet of Powerfully Productive. Deanna, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
And yes, listeners, before we even get started, Deanna Caliquet is Jared Caliquet, your host's wife and partner in life. So I'm sure she could tell you all kinds of really silly stories about how silly I can be at times. But let's talk first about the productivity. So Deanna, when we talk about productivity, what exactly are we talking about?
Well, we're talking about efficiency and effectiveness. And so productivity as a term gets thrown out there pretty loosely, but sometimes people don't really know what that means. If I were to ask the common layperson just randomly on the street, what does productivity mean to you? The most common answer that you'd probably receive is managing time. And while that is true, being productive can mean managing your time very well. The actual meaning of productivity is being efficient and effective.
All right, efficient and effective. So when we talk about productivity, especially with social entrepreneurs, in that social entrepreneurs are often either the head person in their organization or the solo person in their organization. They're wearing many hats and doing many different things. Productivity tends to be a complicated subject for them because no one's kind of telling them what to do, when to do it. And in your work, can you talk a little bit about Powerfully Productive and how you came to start that organization and that enterprise and kind of what you do on a day-to-day basis?
Absolutely. So first, to tackle your first part of the question, which is how do social entrepreneurs really tackle it when they're acting as what we like to term as a solopreneur? And it can be really challenging just because, as you said, they wear so many different hats. It really comes down to discipline when you're a solopreneur, primarily because you are just wearing so many different hats. How do you shift from being a marketer to being a salesperson to being the delivery to managing operations to taking care of your finances to self-development, leadership, management, etc., and all of the other components that I haven't even mentioned as far as running either a social enterprise or even just a regular business. So it can get really hairy really fast.
Yeah.
But it's kind of crazy. I think what's really comes down to is first primarily having the confidence to know that productivity, it's okay to be messy and it's okay to be vulnerable. That's the whole point of being powerfully productive, is to move through the mashugana and the minutia of life and all of the hats that we wear and move forward with concerted effort and focus. I like to work in a snowball effect where I help entrepreneurs or professionals really build their confidence, win at the workflow mastery and that time mastery. That way they're not operating in an ad hoc style. That way they become consistent and with time become powerfully productive.
Okay. And if you were to boil down what exactly productivity is in one sentence, what would it be? What is your definition of productivity?
Productivity, in one sentence, is the ability to take concerted, focused, massive action.
Okay, and massive action. What do you mean by that for our listeners and even myself, that I'm a little bit confused about massive action? What does that mean?
Well, I think massive action, we hear that term also thrown out pretty loosely, like take action, take action, take action. But people don't realize that there's a whole other component to taking action, which is believing in yourself that you have the capacity and the ability and the confidence to take that action. You know, anybody can pick up a pencil and say, I took action. But before you went through a psychological process of, can I physically pick up the pencil, very subconsciously? And not only that, but it's actually the forward momentum and movement toward what it is that you desire. So taking action can be the deliberate movement of a physical form or body into action, or it could be the subconscious perception of taking the smaller steps from a mental perspective, moving towards your desired outcome, whatever that looks like.
Okay, I think I follow you. When you before you started Powerfully Productive, what kind of steps were leading you in that direction? I mean, I understand that you are a business coach, and working with entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs, solo entrepreneurs, as you mentioned earlier, which are entrepreneurs that are just by themselves. So they're solopreneurs. Um, and then you kind of got into the productivity pieces. Talk us through how that happened. Was it a common thing you kept seeing in clients? Was it something that you felt was needed in the market and it was a niche, or is this something that you're really good at, or all of the above?
Well, it was a natural progression, really. And what's really fascinating about it is it kind of just fell on my lap. I'm really naturally good at being pretty self disciplined. When I set my mind to a goal and I'm all in and fully committed into it, I'm pretty much a freight train. And what's really fascinating about that is I believed that everybody else was like that as well. But that really isn't the case. A lot of,
I am not like that.
yes.
I freight train would not be what anyone would describe me. Maybe Thomas the train
Thomas the train.
would be more my speed, or the little engine that could, but a freight train, not so much.
Yeah, so I thought other people were like me, and I was quite surprised that, when I experienced, I was like, wow, people don't have the capacity to focus for a pretty intense period of time on one outcome and see that outcome through. And also, I started being asked a lot of the same question, and basically it got asked over and over again. How do you do what you do? Like, how do you get everything that you do done with everything that you have on your plate? And for a little bit of time, my answer was, I don't know. And that's just being legit and real. I mean, having 3 kids, managing a household, in-laws, 3 dogs, a business, a marriage, being a daughter. I mean, I can keep going on, and it sounds exhausting. To me, it wasn't. I thrive in that environment. So I kept getting asked all these questions, like, how do you do this all? This is crazy. Like, how do you do this? Can you show me how to do it? And I thought everybody could do it. But then I started unpacking my actual process of how I was able to manage everything so efficiently and effectively. And I realized that people wanted to learn that. They wanted to learn how to master their time. They wanted to learn how to become the master of their schedule, how to time block, how to use the Pomodoro method. They wanted to know how to manage their self so they can powerfully manage other people and be an effective influencer and a leader. How to be emotionally intelligent in really difficult times. All of these things are kind of in that same wheelhouse of being powerfully productive. So it's really fascinating how that kind of evolved into that.
No, absolutely. I mean, I am part of that equation, obviously, with the 3 kids and the household and so forth. But hearing you talk about it, it makes me a little tired. I'm getting a little exhausted, even though that's the reality that I live, obviously, as well. So you kind of fell into it, and you also had this, it sounded like an aha moment or epiphany in which you realized other people didn't operate the same way as you. You mentioned, you were a freight train, and then you just thought everyone else was the same way. How do you now in your work and working with entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurs and so forth, how do you feel there I guess what I'm trying to say is, how do you know that there's a lack of productivity on their end that they need help fixing? Because productivity is one of those things that everyone knows what it is and no one knows what it is.
Correct.
And as a leadership educator, that's been one of the most difficult things, is that leadership is like that as well, right? Everyone knows what leadership is and no one knows what leadership is. And I think productivity kind of fit in that same category. Everyone would know what it is, but they also don't know what it is. So how do you identify it, and how do you help people kind of through that process? What does that look like?
Well, that's a really great question, and you're absolutely right. I think there's just so much information out there about how to be productive or what you need to do or how to manage your time or do this or do that. But there's a disconnect between the ideology or the theory piece, and then there's that disconnect into the actual action. Same thing with leadership. There's a lot of information out there of what it is to be a good leader and all of the theory part. But again, that action piece is that disconnect. I think what's really fascinating here when an entrepreneur or solopreneur or even a professional in the corporate sector or the private sector comes to me and says, I'm having challenges in this area, There are a lot of the flags that pop up, and most of the time it's either procrastination or perfectionism. And quite even more fascinating than that, procrastination is actually a symptom of perfectionism, which is kind of mind-blowing for a lot of people because they see and identify them as two separate. But procrastination actually is that symptom of perfectionism because you are sitting on a project completely avoiding it because it isn't perfect yet. But that's technically the definition of a perfectionist. If it's not perfect, you're not doing it. So procrastination is perfectionism, and if you're experiencing either the tendencies to procrastinate or the tendencies to wait or continue to work very vigorously on one project because it isn't perfect yet, you are experiencing challenges in productivity, and I can certainly help there.
That's awesome. Yeah. So I'm going to refer to myself as a perfectionist from now on and not a procrastinator.
I think that's
Um,
good. I'm a recovering perfectionist, and I say recovering because I have understood now, based on my work and all of the behavioral, organizationally and individually, the cognitive behavioral, that it's actually a coping mechanism. So what's really fascinating about that is that we activate our procrastination or our perfectionism because we already know that we're sensing a deficiency within ourselves. And so we're like, okay, well, it's not perfect enough, so I'll just wait on it, or I'll just keep working at it and toiling at it until it is good enough, whatever our perception of good enough is. And sometimes, even when it's the most stellar thing in the world, to other people, external forces would say, wow, this is incredible. In our mind, our perception is still categorizing as it not good enough.
hmm So on a previous episode, we talked about taking the risk and making the leap. It kind of sounds like it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. My product or my service is not good enough, and so thus it's not perfect. So thus I'm going to continue to work on it and enter into almost a state of paralysis around whatever it is, and I never bring it to market. And I in my classes, in my social entrepreneurship classes, I often have students who have a fantastic idea. They have the passion, they have the drive, but I think that they fall into that paralysis. That well, what I have or what I'm doing isn't quite where I want it to be yet, and so I'm going to wait. And one of the primary rules in business is you cannot wait.
No,
Uh,
money loves speed.
yes, money loves speed, right? And maybe speed loves money. I don't know.
Well,
Uh,
time is money and money is time. And so the really, I say fascinating a lot because it just is so darn fascinating all the way around. What's really interesting is that people think of money as the common goal that they want to achieve, especially in business. Like we want to grow our revenues, we want to build wealth. And in social entrepreneurship, it is that dual core driver where we have that value proposition of we either want to solve a social or environmental challenge while building wealth as well. But when we look at it from a money and time perspective, money can always be replaced. Like we ebb and flow, like at the business cycle, we'll have a lot of money and then you'll go into a low period of money. We call that cash flow. But what's really interesting is when we look at it from a time perspective, once the time is gone, it's there. There's not an infinite amount. It's very definite. So once that money, or once the time is invested,
mhm,
right?
mhm.
Not necessarily wasted because we always make choices in our time. Once that time is invested, it's gone. Versus money can always be made more, and we can
Okay.
always find some more money.
Yeah, yeah, and now I'm sure some of our listeners who are social entrepreneurs are thinking, "Wow, if I just had a better cash flow month, that would be fantastic." Because one of the biggest hurdles is finances, right?
Right.
Especially in the beginning, finding enough money to get things up and running and going. So we'll talk about that on another episode, how to tackle that challenge. But I definitely understand when you talk about time being a finite commodity that and there is no way to recoup it,
No.
and so if so I definitely understand what you're saying in that if you lost a bunch of money, there is abilities for you to gain it back, but if you lost a bunch of time, unfortunately there's not a way that you can ever recoup that time, and so it's kind of gone. um, and when I talk to my students, so in the social entrepreneurship class that I teach, and in my work that I work with students, they have to create a social enterprise plan or business plan. And like I said, a lot of them have really great ideas and have really great motivations and reasons for why they want to do what they're going to do or what they want to do. But they fall into that it's not perfect enough, it's not good enough, or they do something else and they get really 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 busy on really small and insignificant pieces of their plans. And they get caught up with, making sure that their website is just perfect or making sure their social media is just perfect or making sure that, whatever it is, insert whatever your thing is, right? And they tend to get paralyzed around that one thing, and the overall picture they don't work on, and the overall work they don't work on. They don't really make any forward progress. Like kind of two steps forward, one step back. Um, so I understand there's a little bit of a tension. You've got to get started and you've got to get moving in the right direction for productivity.
Yes.
But you don't want to get caught up in those small things, right? So how does a social entrepreneur know what is a small thing versus a big thing? I mean, how do they tell the forest from the tree, right?
Well, let's tackle the first part of that, because I think that's a challenge that a lot of people face. They get really distracted on the things that really don't matter. And I like to use an acronym for when, you could use this for when you get stuck in those areas where you're just focusing on those really small things that don't really produce a large ROE. When I'm talking about ROE, I'm talking about a return on effort. We talk about ROI a lot, but in the productivity space, I like to refer to it as a return on effort. And really, that's the subconscious sabotaging your bigger goal because you're not fully confident that you can take this to market and make it a go. So you rather work on the little tiny little details and hyper focus on that because you're not quite sold on the fact that your idea is going to be a success or whatnot. And really, that's a fear of failure.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So in that failure though, it's the inability to be comfortable with being vulnerable and messy. And that goes back to that perfectionism that if it's not perfect yet, then it's not going to happen. So here we're in a society that's so judgmental of if it's not amazing when it comes out of the gate, then it's crap. But that's not necessarily true. Just think of all of the most amazing inventions we've ever experienced in our lifetime or in the multiple lifetimes. They were very, very messy. And it took a lot of courage to even attempt the innovation. And it wasn't right the first time, and it had to go through many, many iterations. But through that vulnerability and that courage of being messy, they were able to then have the product that we have today.
Okay, and you mentioned an acronym. Can you share the acronym with us?
Oh, the acronym is WIN, which is WIN. And when you're feeling stuck in being a perfectionist or procrastinating, I want you to focus on what's important now. So WIN stands for what's important now. So when you are stuck in the past, you get very, very sad, and it's really hard to move past previous failures or attempts or even desire to move forward from whatever it is that you're working. You're kind of stuck there, oh, well, I'm afraid that it's not going to go well, or I've tried this before and it didn't go very well, and so you're stuck in the past. And if you're very anxious and you're constantly trying to be one step ahead of the game, you're very in the future. So what you're doing is you are literally pissing on the now, and that's all that you have is being present. And so if you focus on what's important now, you can recenter and refocus on what's really happening.
Okay. So what's important now? And when you're talking about the entrepreneurs who are focusing on these other things because in part subconsciously they're not fully in, or they're not fully invested in terms of their product or service is going to meet all of the needs. But this is a subconscious thing. This is not a conscious thing, right?
Absolutely. Completely subconscious. Actually, the conscious part of you serves as a protectionary method. The subconscious part of all of us doesn't know the difference between right, wrong, good, or bad. It just acts. And the conscious part, or the logical piece of us, of our brain, really protects us and helps us decipher what's right, what's bad, what's good, what's wrong. And that helps protect the subconscious because, like I said, the subconscious doesn't know any different. So when you are about to do something that is outside of your central belief system, your logical or conscious part of yourself will say, oh, hold on, this is scary. Let's run this through the checks and balance system and see if this is okay with our values, morals, and beliefs. And if it's not, then you are going to deploy your triggers of self-sabotaging behaviors.
Okay, absolutely. So productivity, I mean, obviously it's impossible to break it down in one episode.
It's hard. We probably have to do a part 2.
Yeah. I want to thank you very much for coming in, and for putting up with me 24/7.
Well, you're amazing.
Aw, you hear that? I'm amazing. But let's do a part 2. Let's have you come back, and maybe we can talk specifically about some of the things that really trip people up, and maybe we can start to try to pick some of that apart and move forward. So you've been listening to the Teaching Change podcast, where we explore issues of social entrepreneurship, education, and innovation. I'm your host, Jared Calliquet, and on today's episode, we had Deanna Calliquet of Powerfully Productive. Her website is www.bepowerfullyproductive.com. You can find her on Facebook, Powerfully Productive, on Instagram, Be Powerfully Productive, and the best way to get a hold of her is her email, Deanna, DEANA, at bepowerfullyproductive.com. In the meantime, be nice and change some stuff.